Hello and welcome back to our number eight study on the great 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. These series of studies are based on my book that I wrote on Soren Kierkegaard. It's called Soren Kierkegaard, Night of Infinite Resignation. And these were a series of studies that started at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Cheyenne, Wyoming, way back in October of 2010. And some of the people who either bought my book or came to our study said a further explanation needs to be given. And so I decided to do a step-by-step video analysis of the entire book. And this is number 8 in a series that will probably, I think, probably last till, 20, 30 studies or so. So now it's a great privilege to get into the aesthetic sphere. Now, this is in chapter 4, and this is the first of all of SK's spheres of existence. The first sphere is the aesthetic, the second is the ethical, which is a transitional phase, and the third is the religious, in which SK analyzes the specifically Christian religion. And the first thing in the book that I want to mention on this page is that it should be stated that the so-called stages that SK used, the term, are really more spheres of existence, because they're not mathematical sort of circles where you jump from one to the next, but rather spheres in which your primary view of life changes. The first is the aesthetic sphere. And this is what we're going to analyze here. Now, the aesthetic sphere is actually the widest of all the spheres of existence, and incorporates the broadest, widest existential experiences of all the spheres. And for SK, the aesthetic sphere may be defined as follows. Every conception in which immediacy predominates, i.e. fortune or misfortune directly understood, and or where an individual seeks his telos, which is, of course, Latin for ultimate purpose or goal, outside of himself. It is the widest and most comprehensive of SK's spheres. It includes, in his aesthetic books, everything from the moral depravity of the seducer in Either Or, his most corrupt and evil character, to the composer whom SK considered the greatest composer of all time, and that is Mozart. So it includes an extremely wide variety of people, spheres, ideas, and concepts. And once again, I'm intentionally leaving out the omnibus dubitandum est and concept of irony, because they were just preliminary experiments for SK's thought, and don't have a critical importance. But I will say this, that the omnibus dubitandum est is very well worth reading, and so is concept of irony. But especially, I believe, the omnibus dubitandum est. And anyone who wants to get into SK in depth should really take those books into consideration. But in this book, because I had to limit it, it's 458 pages, I believe, and I could not get into certain of his works. The omnibus dubitandum est would require practically a chapter by itself. So, now the aesthetic sphere at its base, in SK's analysis, is only a set of possibilities for the self. However fascinating, tantalizing, and brilliant they may be. It is not a real life or a real self in process of becoming, but a series of imagination existences. Although the sphere of existence is not the ultimate for the existing individual, the aesthetic sphere is never totally left behind, because SK had a tremendous admiration for the great works of aesthetics, and he wasn't one of these theologians who reject aesthetics like maybe Calvin did. He recognized the importance of aesthetics to an enhancement of life. He loved Shakespeare. He loved Mozart. So you don't want to, you don't want to categorize him as a Philistine person, but someone who recognized the legitimacy of aesthetic enhancement to life, but not as its primary goal. So, to illustrate the nature of the aesthetic sphere of existence, SK wrote Either Or, Volume 1. The purpose of this book, SK describes in the postscript in this way. The first part, Either Or, Volume 1, represents an existential possibility which cannot win through to existence, a melancholy that needs to be ethically worked up. Melancholy is its essential character, and this so deep that although autopathic, it deceptively occupies itself with the sufferings of others. And this is in anticipation of the modern psychological concept that we call projection in psychology. And he wrote an essay on this, and an essay called Shadow Graphs in Either Or, Volume 1. And for the rest, deceives by concealing itself under the cloak of pleasure, rationality, demoralization, the deception and the concealment being at one and the same time its strength in imagination and its weakness in winning through to existence. It is an imagination existence in aesthetic passion, and therefore paradoxical, colliding with time. It is in its maximum despair. It is therefore not existence, but an existential possibility tending toward existence. Because, and we'll get into this a lot more in Sickness Unto Death, to become a self means that you have to choose your God-given self, the God wants all of us to become. And that's the task of being a human being, is to choose oneself and to become the self, the real self that God has given us. We can choose to become another self, but the self God wants us to be is his eternal concept, or his eternal wish for us in choosing our God-given self. And that, once again, we get into in Sickness Unto Death. Now, the title of the work, Either Or, itself suggests a choice. And it represents SK's answer to Hegelian mediation, which he always made fun of. Mediation, when we get into the concept of dread, is a concept we're going to get into in a lot of depth later. But it is sort of an interesting concept, mediation and reconciliation in logic, and how Hegel had this idea that he had been able to bring mediation and reconciliation into logic itself. And therefore, and through this process, he overcame the either or that faces the individual, because in Hegel's thinking, he believed that he had understood the end from the beginning. And Marx, of course, took this idea in dialectical materialism and went full throttle with the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then of course, the the fading away, whatever you want to call it, of the dictatorship of the proletariat to the ultimate worker's paradise. See, for Hegel, in his speculative thinking, in the sense that he thought he had a so-called existential system, existence had for him, at least, a logical finality that excluded an either-or. But in reality, for the existing individual, which S.K. always emphasized that every human being is an existing individual, existence is not finished, and we don't know the end from the beginning. So there's always an either-or, and that's why, that's where he got his title, Either-or. So in this sphere, the aesthetic sphere, it is the self-deception and concealment of the self that keeps the self from choosing its real self through despair. In Volume 1 of Either-or, the nature of this life view, which is despair, is described. And then in Volume 2, which we get into in the ethical sphere, Judge William analyzes this point of view of life in terms of a higher understanding of what it means to be an existing individual. And that we get into in the ethical, which we will be dealing with when we get into the ethical phase or sphere. So, the author of Either-or, Volume 1, is a very intelligent, highly gifted intellectual. He's highly developed in terms of intelligence, imagination, and dialectics. And in this respect, he is the superior of Either-or, Volume 2, who seems Philistine in comparison. He is not, however, the superior of Author B in terms of actually having lived. His existence, as is especially evident in the Diapsamalta, represents despair, hopelessness, and the restless search for meaning. And we see evidence of this in many entertainers. And a person that comes to mind for me is Michael Jackson, many other entertainers who have seemed to not find that search for meaning, that higher understanding of life, and are always searching for a deeper meaning, a deeper truth, and they never, as far as I know, Michael Jackson never really found that center, that God-given center in his life, but it was always a search for something in the aesthetic sphere. So the Diapsamalta is based on a word in Hebrew that comes from, according to Walter Lowry, from the refrains of the Psalms in the Bible. And these are all life views in the aesthetic sphere of searching for something outside of the ethical and the religious in this meaningless quest to find a significance for one's own life. And he uses many different random observations about living in this sphere. And I give a few here. Something wonderful has happened to me in one of his characters. I was caught up to the seventh heaven. There sat all the gods in assembly. By special grace I was granted the privilege of making a wish. Will thou, said Mercury, have youth or beauty or power for a long life, or the most beautiful maiden, or any of the other glories we have in the chest? Choose but only one. For a moment I was at a loss. Then I addressed myself to the gods as follows. Most honorable contemporaries, I choose this one thing, that I may always have the laugh on my side. Not one of the gods said a word. On the contrary, they all began to laugh. From that I concluded that my wish was granted, and found that the gods knew how to express themselves with taste. For it would hardly have been suitable for them to have answered gravely, "Thy wish is granted." And he goes on like this in this vein of this imaginary existence and this search for some sort of meaning. Some of them are these observations are very serious, and some of them, like this one, are just meant to be humorous anecdotes. So this is the beginning of the book Either Or, Volume 1. He speaks about the profound disappointment of philosophy, for example. What the philosophers say about reality is often as disappointing as a sign you see in a shop window which reads, "Pressing done here." If you brought your clothes to be pressed, you would be fooled, for the sign is only for sale. So, and then he talks about what it means to be a poet. What is a poet? An unhappy man who in his heart harbors a deep anguish, but whose lips are so fashioned that he moans and cries, which pass over them, are transformed into ravishing music. His fate is like that of the unfortunate victims whom the tyrant Phalaris imprisoned at a brazen bull and slowly tortured over a steady fire. Their cries could not reach the tyrant's ears so as to strike terror in his heart. When they reached his ears, they sounded like sweet music. That's the fate for S.K. as a poet. And S.K. was a poet, and he had a lot of bad experiences. He was a very inward person, or sensitive person, you might say. The breakup of his engagement with Regina, for example, caused him immense emotional turmoil. So he's speaking largely in his own experience and what he went through and what many other poets go through. If you look at history and how they come to produce these marvelous works that they produce through a lot of pain in their own lives. So after the Diapsalmata, there follows an essay called The Immediate Stages of the Erotic, or the Musical Erotic. In this essay, the author, as with all of the pseudonyms, one must also, of course, suspect there is a tremendous amount of SK in each of his pseudonyms and his characters, although he denies it, like we talked about in an earlier study. But in this essay, he analyzes the work that he considered the greatest aesthetic work ever written, and that was Mozart's Don Giovanni. And he takes this as a example of great art, and he takes this to analyze all art forms in terms of his aesthetic theory. For S.K., all great artistic productions are characterized by one essential element: the absolute harmony of two forces, form and content. Only when the idea reposes with transparent clearness in a definite form can it be called a classic work. But then it will also be able to stand the tests of time. And he goes into a further analysis in all of this by analyzing different art forms. It's when you have this identity of idea and content that you have a perfect work of art, or the most ideal work of art. And in each form of art, each form lends itself better to certain ideas than to others. The more concrete an idea is, and that means concrete, when he says concrete, he means having a particular time and place. The more concrete an idea, the better it will lend itself to a representation in language, because language is the most concrete of all aesthetic mediums, having a particular time and place of occurrence. By contrast, the sensuous genius expressed by Don Juan is the most abstract of ideas, and the abstract ideas lend itself far better to music. And actually, architecture, painting, sculpture as well. And he goes into an analysis of how the sensuous in Greek thinking differ so much from the sensuous in Christian thinking, because in Greek thinking there was no moral censure for the sensuous, but it was a part of life. In the Christian understanding, and there is a moral censure. So I think I try to give a brief explanation of SK's theory of aesthetics in this way. All great aesthetic works are characterized by the complete harmony of two things, form and content. The more abstract the content, the better it lends itself to architecture, music, and painting. The more concrete the content, the better it lends itself to poetry and literature. And this isn't a perfect definition, because there are many overlapping aspects to, of course, to aesthetic, which cannot be completely defined, but these are major parts of aesthetics. For example, architecture is the most abstract of all the art forms. When you look at a building, and I always use the state capitol in Cheyenne, Wyoming, as a perfect example of a great architectural accomplishment. And when you look at the building, you try to think, well, what does this represent? Well, it represents equality, it represents justice, it represents stability, and those sort of ideas. But those are abstract ideas, because there's no one time and place where those concepts of equality, justice, stability, etc. exist. But they exist as an abstraction in the mind. And so architecture is the most abstract of all aesthetic expressions. And then the more concrete the idea, having a particular time and a particular place, the better it lends itself to poetry and literature. And then the second factor is that when you introduce the aspect of time, the better the subject matter will lend itself to music and literature. And I am sure if SK were alive today, he would add film. In literature, for example, an epic story would lend itself to literature. And of course, the prime example of this is Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. In more modern literature, I think SK would include works such as War and Peace and Gone with the Wind. These are concrete ideas with the aspect of time, and they represent things that happened at a particular time in a particular place and had the element of time involved. So it's not the intention of my book to analyze every aspect of Either Or Volume 1. I highly recommend it. There's tremendous essays analyzing a lot of Mozart's works. But I had to keep the book a little brief, and I'm not saying I'm an expert in some of the essays in this book, but I tried to pick out the important elements of Either Or Volume 1 in order to give a person a good basic understanding of what the book is all about. There follows a discussion of the erotic and the analysis of Mozart's music in particular, analyzes Page and Figaro, Papageno and the Magic Flute, and then finally Don Juan and Don Giovanni. The next essay has to do with an analysis of the ancient tragical motif as reflected in the modern, which is a paper that was given before a mysterious Greek society called I can't even pronounce the word, but roughly it's a Greek word that means Fellowship of the Dead. The next essay is Shadowgraphs, and once again, this is an essay that, if I can see the time, we got about 4 minutes. This is an essay that, once again, has this concept of the psychological idea of projection that we talk about so much in modern psychology. And I think S.K. was one of the first psychologists to really see that phenomenon in the modern thinking, the modern psychology. The next essay is called The Unhappiest Man, which is an analysis of unhappiness and how it comes about and how it can be overcome in the aesthetic stage. This is the theme that is repeated in the rotation method. And these are all essays in Either Or Volume 1. I'm not going to get into them in depth because we'd be here for the next 5 years, but it gives you an idea. And then there's the essay called First Love. This is an analysis of the comedy written by Scribe. The final essay in this book is called Diary of the Seducer, and this was the most popular essay of all of S.K.'s essays in this book in Copenhagen and in Denmark, and it made him a famous author. And S.K. says about the book that, unfortunately, vulgarity is always popular. And I would add this about this book: it's very mild by today's standards. It would be not even PG rated. I don't think. It's a very intellectual analysis of how a seducer goes about seducing a young woman, and it's not what most people probably think about, or what a seducer is all about. Very intellectual analysis. Okay, well, let's see. It's getting a little late to get into the rest of this, but to give you a foretaste of what we're going to look at next, we're going to look at also the aesthetic sphere in Stages on Life's Way. And this was a repetition, and S.K. loved repetitions. He loved dealing with the same topic over and over again and looking at it from a little different point of view each time, because he saw more and more in every idea after he reflected on it over and over again. And he said the greatest writers use repetition because they can see a significant idea and analyze it from a lot of different points of view. So we're going to get into Stages on Life's Way, and especially in We No Veritas, and then we will go on into the philosophical works, which are called the Fragments and the philosophical, the unscientific postscript to the philosophical fragment. So I hope you join me next time.